Is your kingdom constantly under attack by curses, dark magic, questionable royalty, and random old women carrying dangerous knitting equipment? Well, congratulations, sweetheart. You may be living inside a medieval horror story. Introducing the fairy tale safety system. Medieval protection for modern problems. For centuries, royal families ignored every warning sign imaginable. Mysterious fairy shows up uninvited. Hey, let her in. Ancient prophecy about a spindle? Nah, what's the worst that could happen? Strange prince climbing through enchanted death thorns? Sounds romantic. Fantastic decision-making process, by the way. With the fairy tale safety system, you can finally protect your kingdom from centuries of catastrophic fairy tale stupidity. Our professional spindle detection technology, TM, immediately alerts your castle staff when suspicious knitting activity is detected within 500 yards. Warning. Warning. Potential cursed grandmother approaching. Our patented Constant Castle security package helps prevent emotionally devastating plot developments before they happen. No prince enters the tower without proper authorization, because apparently nobody in medieval Europe believed in locking a damn door. And for families concerned about magical retaliation, our fairy invitation verification system carefully screens all supernatural guests before birthday parties. If your glowing magical ass ain't on the scroll, you ain't getting in. But wait, there's more. Order now and receive the Ogress Family Dinner Prevention Kit absolutely free. Because if somebody at the royal banquet starts whispering, "Eat," you are eating your own. You got bigger problems than table manners. Each kit includes holy candles, Sunar emergency therapy monks, anti-curse garlic, Huanai one emotional support goat, and a complimentary copy of So Your Fairy Tale is Actually a Horror Story, a best-selling medieval survival guide. And remember, true love does not usually arrive unannounced on horseback at 3 in the morning. That's called trespassing. Stop the curses. Protect the kingdom. And maybe, just maybe, put some damn security around the unconscious princess. Fairy tale safety systems. Because somebody in these stories should have called the cops. Disclaimer. The following documentary contains ancient demons, Bronze Age metallurgy, psychological trauma, medieval sexual politics, industrial capitalism, magical name curses, and at least one tiny screaming man exploding into the earth because somebody finally called him by his government name. Viewer discretion is advised. This program is intended for educational, historical, and existentially uncomfortable purposes only. Pizzaverse Studios does not recommend making deals with goblin-looking night creatures, trusting kings, giving strangers your firstborn child, or entering any economic system requiring 14-hour shifts beside a textile machine. Any resemblance between Rumplestiltskin and toxic employers, manipulative family members, exploitative governments, pyramid schemes, internet cult leaders, live stream drama channels, or that one guy who says, "Trust me, sweetheart," before ruining your life, is purely coincidental. Probably. This documentary may contain generational trauma, historical rage, ancient symbolism, suspicious little men, emotional damage disguised as folklore, and enough unresolved human suffering to power a Victorian factory. Remember, fairy tales were never written to comfort you. They were written to warn you.
Rumplestiltskin. The 4,000-year secret hidden inside the fairy tale. A Pizzaverse Studios documentary. A Palermo Productions original. Created by Bambi Palermo. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. Research and historical breakdown. The Pizzaverse Social Club. Special thanks. Everybody who survived childhood fairy tales and later realized, hold on a second, this is actually horrifying. Everyone knows Rumplestiltskin. The strange little man who spins straw into gold. The desperate girl trapped in a tower. The impossible bargain. The secret name that destroys the monster. But what if I told you this story is older than most civilizations? Older than Germany, older than Christianity, older than Rome. What if this isn't really a fairy tale at all? What if Rumplestiltskin is actually a 4,000-year-old survival manual, rewritten over generations by societies trying to explain exploitation, power, greed, technology, and fear? Because hidden inside this story is the same warning humanity keeps repeating over and over again. There is always a force promising miraculous transformation, and it always wants something in return. This is not the story of a funny little goblin. This is the story of power itself. The story you thought you knew. Every generation hears the story the same way. A strange little man, a frightened girl, a king obsessed with gold, a magical spinning wheel, a secret name. Simple. Almost childish. That's how fairy tales survive. They disguise themselves as harmless bedtime stories while carrying something much older underneath. Like old ruins buried beneath newer cities, every retelling covers over ancient fears that never fully disappeared. And Rumplestiltskin may be one of the oldest examples we have. Because underneath the nursery rhyme surface, this is not a comforting story at all. It's a story about impossible labor, about exploitation, about power, about desperation, and about a young woman trapped inside a system designed by men more powerful than she is. The story begins with a lie. A miller, poor, ambitious, and desperate to impress authority, boasts that his daughter can spin straw into gold. Think about how insane that statement actually is. He doesn't say she's kind. He doesn't say she's intelligent. He doesn't say she's brave. Her value is immediately framed through production, through output, through her ability to generate wealth, and he lies about it. Why? Because throughout history, poor men have always tried to leverage women as economic assets inside systems they themselves could not control. The king hears the rumor and reacts exactly the way powerful people often react when they hear about infinite profit. Not with curiosity, with greed. He drags the girl into a tower chamber piled high with straw and gives her an impossible command. Turn this worthless material into gold by morning or die. That's the real engine of the fairy tale. Not magic. Coercion. The daughter is not invited into opportunity. She is cornered into survival. And notice something important. The king never asks whether the story is true. Because people in positions of power often do not care whether expectations are realistic. They only care whether results appear. The room itself matters too. Locked away, alone, at night. This isn't a whimsical fantasy environment. It's psychological imprisonment. The spinning room becomes one of the oldest recurring symbols in folklore, the isolated chamber where impossible labor is demanded from women under threat of punishment. And then he appears. Not with thunder, not with fire, not as some towering demon king, but as something small, crooked, strange, almost ridiculous. Rumplestiltskin enters the story the way real danger often enters human life, not looking terrifying at first glance, but deeply wrong in a way the mind immediately recognizes. And he offers exactly what systems of desperation always produce: a deal. That's what makes him frightening, not because he uses violence, because he understands leverage. The girl is trapped between impossible authority and supernatural negotiation. She cannot complete the task herself, so she bargains. First the necklace, then the ring. Each payment strips away another piece of identity, status, and security. And by the third night, there is nothing left except the most horrifying currency imaginable, her future child. That moment is the true heart of the tale. Not the spinning, not the gold, not even the magic. The contract. Because the story understands something ancient and deeply human, exploitation becomes most dangerous when survival forces people to sacrifice tomorrow in order to survive today. The girl agrees because she has no meaningful choice, and that distinction matters. For centuries, storytellers softened this moment into fantasy, but older audiences would have immediately understood the terror involved here. In the ancient world, children were survival itself, your labor force, your lineage, your security in old age, your continuation after death. To surrender your child was to surrender your future. But the king gets his gold, of course he does. And like many systems built on exploitation, success immediately erases the suffering that produced it. The girl becomes queen. The tower disappears. The kingdom prospers. On the surface, it almost looks like a happy ending, until the child is born. And suddenly the forgotten bargain returns to collect its debt. That may be the most realistic detail in the entire story. Because societies have always buried the human cost of prosperity until the bill eventually arrives. Rumplestiltskin comes back not screaming, not raging, not destroying the kingdom. He simply asks for what he was promised. The contract matters to him because contracts are the entire foundation of his power. And when the queen collapses in grief, the creature offers one final loophole. If she can discover his true name within 3 days, she may keep the child. Modern audiences hear this as random fairy tale logic. Ancient audiences would have heard something very different. Because across countless early civilizations, names were not just labels. Names were believed to contain essence, authority, identity, power. To know the true name of something was to gain control over it. The queen sends messengers across the land collecting names desperately, almost like assembling pieces of hidden knowledge. And finally, on the last night, the answer arrives. Rumplestiltskin. The moment she speaks the name aloud, everything changes. The creature loses control instantly. In some versions, he screams. In others, he tears himself apart. In others, he drives himself into the earth in pure rage. But every version shares the same core truth. Once named, his power collapses. And that's the detail that survived 4,000 years. Not the spinning wheel, not the tower, not even the gold. The naming. The story insists over and over again that unnamed power is invincible, but identified power can be defeated. And that idea would survive every civilization the story passed through. Bronze Age metalworkers, Egyptian priests, medieval peasants, industrial factory laborers, modern psychologists. Every generation rewrote the details. but they all preserve the same warning. There is always something operating in the dark, demanding impossible labor in exchange for survival. And the first step toward freedom is learning its true name. The Bronze Age origin. Before spinning wheels, there was fire. To understand Rumplestiltskin, we have to travel backward farther than most people realize. Far beyond medieval Germany. Far beyond castles and kings. Far beyond spinning wheels. Back to the Bronze Age. 4,000 years ago, somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, an old story is already taking shape beside a fire. But it doesn't look like the version we know. There is no tiny man hopping around a spinning wheel. No fairy tale castle. No golden-haired princess trapped in a tower. Instead, there is smoke. Fire. Stone. And men working miracles in darkness. Imagine standing in an ancient settlement around 2000 BC. Mud brick walls. Reed roofs. Animal hides stretched across wooden frames. The smell of river water and ash hanging permanently in the air. And somewhere beyond the edge of the village, hidden away from ordinary people, something terrifying is happening inside a forge. Because metallurgy, the act of pulling metal from stone, looked supernatural to the ancient world. And honestly, you can understand why. Gray, worthless rocks disappear into fire, and glowing metal emerges. To us, it's chemistry. To them, it looked like sorcery. The first smiths were not treated like ordinary craftsmen. They occupied a strange place in early societies, essential but feared. Communities depended on them for tools, weapons, farming equipment, jewelry, survival itself. But at the same time, people distrusted them deeply because nobody fully understood how they performed their transformations. These men knew secret things. Which ores mattered, which stones concealed hidden wealth, how hot the fires needed to burn, how air changed flame, how earth became treasure. Knowledge itself became frightening. And this is where the earliest skeleton of Rumplestiltskin likely begins to emerge. Not as a goblin. Not as an imp. But as the memory of dangerous craftsmen who could transform worthless material into unimaginable value. Because straw into gold makes a lot more sense once you realize ancient audiences already lived in a world where impossible transformation existed. The forge was the original spinning room. Locked away, hidden at night, illuminated by unnatural fire. And the smith himself becomes our first Rumplestiltskin figure. A mysterious outsider with secret knowledge capable of miraculous production. But ancient societies rarely viewed specialized knowledge as neutral. Knowledge always carried spiritual suspicion. Across the ancient world, smiths became associated with liminal spaces, thresholds between civilization and something darker underneath it. In Anatolia and Mesopotamia, metal workers often lived outside ordinary settlements because their fires were dangerous and their craft carried ritual significance. People whispered about what happened in those workshops. How could ordinary men command fire itself? How could stone become metal? How could earth suddenly become wealth? The answer many communities arrived at was simple. Maybe these men weren't entirely human anymore. You see echoes of this fear everywhere in later mythology. The Greek god Hephaestus, divine blacksmith of Olympus, is physically deformed and isolated from other gods. Norse mythology gives us dwarven smiths living underground, creating magical weapons while demanding terrible prices for their labor. Wayland the smith, One of the clearest descendants of this ancient archetype is imprisoned by a king who fears his abilities and wants control over his knowledge. That detail matters. Because rulers have always feared people who possess transformative knowledge outside centralized authority, technology threatens power structures. It always has. And suddenly Rumpelstiltskin starts looking very different. Not a random magical creature. It always has. And suddenly Rumpelstiltskin starts looking very different. Not a random magical creature. A cultural memory. A fossilized echo of humanity's first encounter with specialized technological power. The impossible task itself begins to make more sense too. Ancient stories often exaggerate real human anxieties into symbolic form. Turning straw into gold may sound absurd to modern ears, but to Bronze Age listeners already witnessing miraculous material transformation through metallurgy, it reflected a very real terror. What happens when some people gain access to powers ordinary communities cannot understand? The daughter in this early layer of the story represents something larger than an individual woman. She becomes the community itself. Desperate, dependent, forced into bargains with powers beyond its understanding. And the price demanded in return? The future. The child. Because every major technological leap in human history creates the same fear. Will this knowledge liberate the next generation or enslave it? That anxiety is already present here at the beginning of civilization. Even the secret name element may have roots in ancient metallurgy. Early craftsmen guarded technical knowledge obsessively. Recipes for alloy mixtures, furnace temperatures, ore locations. These were valuable secrets passed carefully between generations. To know the true name of a process was to control it. Knowledge itself functioned almost like magic. And in many ways it was. This is why the Bronze Age layer matters so much. It establishes the foundation every later civilization would build upon. A miraculous transformation, a mysterious figure operating in shadows, a desperate bargain, a terrible price, and hidden knowledge that grants power over forces otherwise impossible to control. That structure survives because human beings keep encountering the same problem over and over again. Something appears capable of changing the world. The people controlling it seem strange, isolated, almost supernatural. And society becomes trapped between awe and fear. The forge becomes the factory. The factory becomes the corporation. The corporation becomes the algorithm. Different centuries. Same anxiety, and buried underneath all of it is the oldest version of Rumpelstiltskin. A story born from humanity staring into fire for the first time and realizing somebody had learned how to make miracles. The secret power of names. To name was to control. As the Rumpelstiltskin story traveled across ancient trade routes, something strange began to happen to it. The Bronze Age blacksmith faded into the background, and in his place emerged something far more frightening. The supernatural. The story leaves the forge behind and enters a world obsessed with invisible powers, sacred words, hidden identities, and cosmic authority. Because in the ancient world, names were not casual things. A name was not just what people called you. A name was what you were. And if somebody discovered your true name, they could control you. Modern audiences tend to hear the "guess my name" portion of Rumpelstiltskin almost like a children's riddle. Cute, silly, arbitrary fairy tale nonsense. Ancient civilizations would have heard it very differently. To them, this was deadly serious. Travel to ancient Egypt. The temples rise massive against the desert sky. Priests move through torchlit halls carrying incense and sacred texts. Every wall is covered in hieroglyphs because writing itself is believed to possess divine force. And inside this civilization exists one of the most important myths ever attached to the power of names: the story of Isis and Ra. Ra, the sun god, rules creation itself. His power is absolute. But Isis, brilliant and ambitious, understands something critical. No being is truly invincible if its hidden name can be discovered. So she devises a plan. According to the myth, Isis gathers dust from the earth and mixes it with the saliva of Ra himself. From this she forms a serpent, a creature carrying the essence of the god it is meant to attack. The serpent bites Ra. Immediately, the poison spreads through his body. The sun god collapses in agony. The creator of the universe screams helplessly while lesser gods panic around him. But Isis refuses to heal him, not until he reveals the one thing he has hidden since the beginning of time: his true secret name. Finally, writhing in unbearable pain, Ra whispers it into her ear. And the instant he does, the balance of power changes forever. Because once Isis knows the hidden name of the sun god, she gains authority over him. Not symbolic authority. Real authority. That was the ancient mindset. Names were cosmic leashes. To speak the true name of something was to grasp its essence directly. And suddenly the climax of Rumplestiltskin stops looking random. The queen is not solving a puzzle. She is performing an act of magical domination rooted in one of humanity's oldest spiritual beliefs. As the story moved through Babylonian, Hebrew, and Mediterranean cultures, this idea intensified. Ancient Mesopotamian civilizations believed reality itself could be manipulated through sacred language. Priests and magicians memorized enormous collections of names for spirits, demons, illnesses, and gods because naming created authority over chaos. The Babylonians feared entities called Utuku, wandering spirits existing between worlds. The Hebrews described Shadim, dangerous supernatural beings who operated at the edges of human society. The Greeks would later call similar entities daemons. Not devils exactly. Something older. Ambiguous beings that could help or destroy depending on how they were approached. And across all these cultures, the same rule keeps appearing. If you know the entity's true name, you gain power over it. That belief shaped entire societies. In some Jewish traditions, children were deliberately given misleading names to confuse evil spirits or even the angel of death itself. A healthy child might be nicknamed Alter, meaning old man, to make supernatural forces lose interest. Others received names meaning comfort or poor one as spiritual camouflage. Imagine living in a world where names were treated like protective spells, where identity itself became a battlefield. That's the world Rumpelstiltskin enters during this phase of its evolution. And the story changes accordingly. The mysterious helper is no longer just a craftsman with forbidden knowledge. Now he becomes something inhuman. A being from outside ordinary reality. Notice how many later descriptions emphasize his strangeness. His twisted body, his strange voice, his unnatural movements, his nighttime appearances. He enters locked rooms without explanation. He knows impossible things. He operates through contracts and hidden terms. He behaves less like a human being and more like a summoned entity. This reflects the spiritual anxieties of the ancient world. Civilizations surrounded by disease, famine, invasion, and death often imagined invisible forces lurking behind reality itself. Demons became explanations for suffering that felt otherwise impossible to control. and Rumplestiltskin evolves into one of these liminal figures, a creature between worlds who offers miracles for a price. But the most important transformation happens in the Queen herself. In the Bronze Age layer, survival depended on understanding dangerous technology. Now, survival depends on knowledge itself. Language becomes the weapon. The Queen defeats the creature not with strength, violence, or divine intervention. She wins by uncovering hidden truth. That's profoundly important, especially for a story centered around a woman inside patriarchal societies where physical power belonged overwhelmingly to men. The fairy tale quietly preserves a radical idea. Knowledge can overturn domination, even supernatural domination. And this explains why the true name concept survived for thousands of years. Because psychologically it reflects something deeply human. Unnamed fear becomes infinite. The thing hiding in darkness always feels larger than the thing understood clearly. Ancient people experienced this spiritually. Modern people experience it psychologically. But the mechanism is identical. The unknown controls us because we cannot define it. Once identified, its power weakens. That's why the climax still works today. Not because modern audiences literally believe names hold magical force, but because the emotional logic remains true. The moment something hidden becomes visible, its spell begins to break. And this ancient layer of Rumplestiltskin preserves that lesson with terrifying precision. The demon only loses once somebody learns exactly what it is. Not before. Never before. Which means this story was already teaching humanity something essential thousands of years ago. Power survives best in secrecy, and truth begins with naming. The medieval nightmare. Marriage, power, and transaction. By the Middle Ages, Rumpelstiltskin had traveled across centuries of war, migration, trade routes, collapsing empires, and oral storytelling. And now the story changes again. Because medieval Europe had its own horrors to add. The ancient forge disappears further into myth. The demonic symbolism remains. But now the tale absorbs the anxieties of feudal society, a world where your survival depended entirely on the whims of powerful men. And suddenly the story becomes disturbingly grounded. Picture a medieval German village sometime around the 1300s. Narrow, muddy roads. Rotting wood homes pressed together against brutal winters. Smoke pouring from chimneys into gray skies. Church bells ringing across fields worked by exhausted peasants who will never own the land they die on. This is not a world of freedom. This is a hierarchy. God above kings. Kings above nobles. Nobles above peasants. Men above women. Everybody trapped beneath someone else. And inside this rigid system, the Rumpelstiltskin story begins reflecting the brutal economics of survival. The miller himself changes meaning during this era. Modern audiences imagine him as a harmless old peasant. But in many medieval towns, millers occupied an uneasy social position. They controlled grain processing, one of the most essential resources in society, and were often viewed with suspicion. People accused millers constantly of cheating measurements, skimming grain, manipulating prices, exploiting the poor. The medieval imagination saw them as ambitious opportunists hovering awkwardly between peasant and merchant classes. And that detail matters. Because the story begins with upward social ambition. The miller lies about his daughter not simply out of pride, but because medieval society rewarded proximity to power even when it destroyed ordinary people in the process. One conversation with a king could elevate your family forever or annihilate it overnight. That fear saturates the story. The king himself only truly emerges in this medieval layer. And he is important because medieval kings were not abstract authority figures. To ordinary people, they were terrifying. Absolute rulers capable of imprisonment, execution, confiscation, forced marriage, military conscription, all through divine right. The king in Rumplestiltskin behaves exactly like feudal authority behaves. He hears a rumor about wealth and immediately turns a woman into property. Notice how quickly the daughter loses all agency. She is transported, locked away, ordered to produce value, threatened with death if she fails. This isn't fantasy anymore. This is feudal labor logic wearing fairy tale clothing. And the spinning room itself takes on a darker meaning in medieval Europe because spinning was overwhelmingly associated with women's domestic labor. For centuries, spinning thread was one of the primary economic contributions available to women. It was repetitive, exhausting, time-consuming work performed endlessly inside the home. The image of a woman trapped overnight producing impossible quantities of material would have felt horrifyingly familiar to medieval audiences. And then there's Rumpelstiltskin himself. This is where the story develops its most uncomfortable undertones. In 1577, writer Johann Fischart references a children's game known as Rumpelstilt, involving a strange, limping figure who barges into homes demanding things from frightened participants. But the joke wasn't innocent. Like many medieval folk traditions, it carried crude sexual undertones adults understood perfectly well while children remained oblivious. Even the name itself likely carried associations with wrinkled, awkward, distorted male anatomy. Grotesque humor was everywhere in medieval Europe, especially surrounding bodies, reproduction, and sex. And once you recognize that context, the story becomes much more disturbing. Because now Rumpelstiltskin's 3 nighttime visits start reading less like magical encounters and more like symbolic violations. A young woman isolated in a locked room. A strange male figure entering privately at night. A transactional exchange escalating each encounter. Payment demanded for making gold. And eventually, the demand for a child. The medieval audience would have recognized exactly what kind of anxieties this reflected. Marriage itself was often transactional. Women's bodies functioned as economic assets inside political and family arrangements controlled by men. Producing children, especially heirs, was considered obligation as much as love. The fairy tale quietly encodes the terror of that system. And suddenly the phrase, making gold, becomes deeply sinister. Because in parts of medieval German folklore, references to gold production occasionally carried euphemistic associations with fertility, conception, and reproduction. Rumpelstiltskin no longer simply creates wealth. He becomes tied to the terrifying reality that women's reproductive futures were often negotiated by others. The daughter is traded first by her father, then by the king, then cornered into bargaining with the supernatural itself. Every stage of the story revolves around men negotiating ownership over her future. That's why the child matters so much. The firstborn represents dynastic continuity, inheritance, survival, bloodline legitimacy, the entire structure medieval society obsessed over. And Rumpelstiltskin's demand feels horrifying because he cuts directly into the core of that system. He doesn't ask for money. He asks for lineage. The thing the entire medieval world was built around. And yet, despite all this darkness, the story still preserves one critical idea from its older versions. Knowledge remains the only escape. Not strength, not rescue, not morality. Knowledge. The queen survives because she learns something hidden. And that matters enormously in a society where women often possessed very little formal power. Fairy tales frequently allowed women forms of intelligence denied to them publicly in real life: intuition, observation, secret knowledge, social cunning. The queen defeats the creature through information gathering. She sends messengers, collects names, studies hidden truth. She becomes an investigator inside her own nightmare. And when she finally speaks the name aloud, the medieval world hears something very specific happening. The powerless person has identified the force exploiting them. That moment threatens every oppressive structure, because feudal power depended heavily on the idea that hierarchy was natural, unquestionable, eternal. But Rumpelstiltskin quietly suggests something dangerous underneath its fairy tale surface. Systems of domination survive only while they remain mysterious. Once exposed clearly, their spell weakens. And that lesson would become even more explosive when Europe entered the Industrial Revolution. Because soon the spinning wheel itself was about to disappear. And the fairy tale would once again reinvent itself around a brand new form of human exploitation. The factory replaces the forge. The Industrial Revolution rewrites the story. By the late 1700s, Europe begins changing faster than at any other point in human history. Villages swell into cities. Smoke floods the sky. Machines replace hands. And the old world starts dying loud. For thousands of years, human labor had remained mostly recognizable. A blacksmith looked similar to his ancestors. A farmer still used the same basic rhythms as generations before him. Women spun thread inside cottages much the same way medieval women had done centuries earlier. Then the machines arrived. And suddenly, humanity no longer controlled production. Production controlled humanity. This is the moment Rumpelstiltskin mutates again. Because now the spinning wheel becomes something entirely different. Not domestic labor. Industrial labor. And the fairy tale transforms into a nightmare about capitalism itself. Walk through a German village in 1750 and spinning is everywhere. You hear it constantly. The soft rhythm of wheels turning inside homes. Women working while children sleep nearby. Thread hanging from wooden beams. Conversation and songs blending into repetitive motion. Spinning was difficult work, but it belonged to the household. A skilled spinner could contribute economically to family survival. Some women even earned independent income selling thread or textiles. The word spinster originally wasn't an insult. It meant a woman with productive skill. A woman who could sustain herself. That matters because Rumpelstiltskin centers entirely around spinning labor. Even in earlier versions, the wheel symbolized women's economic function inside society. But industrialization destroys that world. Factories centralize production. Machines accelerate output beyond human capability. And suddenly centuries of domestic labor become obsolete almost overnight. By the early 1800s, textile mills dominate entire cities. Manchester, Leeds, the Ruhr Valley. Gigantic buildings roar with mechanical violence 24 hours a day. The air inside is thick with dust and oil. Children crawl beneath dangerous machines because adults are too large to fit. Fingers are crushed. Hair gets caught in spinning mechanisms. Women stand for 14 hours operating equipment they do not own, while factory owners accumulate fortunes beyond imagination. And now Rumpelstiltskin begins to look less like a goblin and more like the industrial system itself. Think about it. A mysterious force capable of impossible production, turning worthless material into enormous wealth, demanding escalating sacrifice in return, operating through exploitative contracts, consuming generations. That is industrial capitalism in fairy tale form. The old supernatural fears merge seamlessly with modern economic terror. because factories felt supernatural too. To rural populations entering industrial cities for the first time, mills looked monstrous. Massive iron structures powered by steam and flame, producing endless rivers of fabric faster than human beings could comprehend. The machine becomes the new forge. And just like the Bronze Age smiths, the people controlling these systems seemed to possess almost magical power over transformation itself. Except now the miracle belonged to corporations, not communities. The daughter's impossible task also changes meaning during this period. In earlier eras, spin straw into gold represented magical transformation. Now it mirrors industrial production quotas. Produce more, work faster, meet impossible expectations, or starve. The king's threat suddenly resembles factory discipline. Workers during the Industrial Revolution lived under constant economic coercion. If you failed production demands, there was no safety net waiting for you. No labor protections, no unions, no health care, no meaningful rights. You either produced or your family suffered. And for women especially, industrialization became deeply destabilizing. The old spinning wheel gave many women at least partial control over their labor within domestic spaces. Factories stripped that away and relocated production into male-owned industrial systems. The machine now controlled the pace, the hours, the value. The worker became an extension of industrial machinery itself. That's why the child becomes even more horrifying in this version of the story. The firstborn no longer symbolizes only lineage or dynastic inheritance. Now it represents generational debt, the inheritance of poverty, the way entire bloodlines became trapped inside industrial exploitation. Children born into factory families frequently entered the same labor systems almost immediately. 8-year-olds worked textile mills. 10-year-olds cleaned machinery. Entire generations disappeared into repetitive labor cycles that enriched owners while destroying workers physically and psychologically. Rumpelstiltskin's bargain suddenly becomes terrifyingly modern, short-term survival purchased through long-term sacrifice. And that's the defining psychological structure of industrial capitalism. The present consumes the future. The daughter agrees to the bargain because she is cornered by impossible circumstances. Factory workers throughout Europe faced identical choices constantly. Take the dangerous job, accept the exploitative wages, sacrifice health, sacrifice childhood, sacrifice tomorrow, or die. The fairy tale survives because the emotional structure never stopped being relevant. And this is the exact historical moment when the brothers Grimm begin collecting folklore. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm are not wandering through some timeless magical Germany. They are living through industrial upheaval, national identity crises, economic transformation, urbanization, the collapse of old traditions. The world around them feels unstable and frightening, and suddenly preserving old stories becomes politically important. Not merely culturally important. Politically important. Because folklore becomes a tool for defining national identity in a rapidly industrializing world. The Grimms are not simply recording fairy tales. They are constructing a moral mythology for modern Germany, which explains why their version of Rumpelstiltskin grows harsher, cleaner, more morally absolute than many earlier oral traditions. Industrial societies demand discipline, obedience, clear categories of good and evil. And so the fairy tale adapts once again. The strange little trickster who once escaped laughing in older folk versions is about to become something much darker. Something that cannot merely lose. Something that must be violently destroyed. Because the modern world was becoming obsessed with purification itself. And the brothers Grimm were about to rewrite the ending accordingly. The Brothers Grimm changed the ending. The violence was added later. Most people imagine fairy tales as ancient, untouched things. Stories drifting unchanged through centuries like little magical time capsules. But that's not how folklore works. Stories evolve because human beings rewrite them constantly to match the fears, politics, and moral systems of their era. And few people shaped that process more aggressively than the Brothers Grimm. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm are often remembered as harmless collectors of children's stories, two dusty academics wandering through Germany, writing down quaint little folk tales beside candlelight. That image is nonsense. The Grimms were editors, nationalists, cultural architects, and in many ways they were trying to build the psychological foundation of modern Germany through folklore itself. To understand what they did to Rumpelstiltskin, you have to understand the world they lived in. Germany in the early 1800s was not a unified nation yet. It was fragmented into kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and territories constantly shaped by war, especially after the chaos unleashed by Napoleon. National identity became an obsession. What makes Germans German? What traditions belong to the people? What stories define moral order? Folklore suddenly became political infrastructure, and the Grimms believed fairy tales could preserve what industrialization and modernization were erasing. So between 1812 and 1857, they collected, rewrote, sanitized, reshaped, and published stories they claimed represented authentic German folk tradition. But authenticity is complicated, because many of these stories were heavily altered, especially Rumpelstiltskin. In earlier oral versions of the tale, the ending was strange, but not catastrophic. When the queen reveals the creature's name, Rumpelstiltskin simply loses. Sometimes he screams. Sometimes he stomps away. In one version, he literally rides out the window on a cooking spoon or ladle. Rumpelstiltskin dies grotesquely. But the king? The man whose greed caused the entire nightmare. He survives untouched. He keeps the gold, keeps the kingdom, keeps the wife, keeps the child. The system itself remains perfectly intact. That detail exposes something fascinating about the Grimm version. The story pretends to condemn exploitation, but only punishes the outsider figure. The supernatural intruder becomes the sole embodiment of evil, while institutional power escapes accountability entirely. That's not accidental. 19th century nationalism depended heavily on identifying threats outside the social order, rather than critiquing the order itself. The dangerous thing becomes the strange thing, the foreign thing, the abnormal thing, the creature living at society's edges. Meanwhile, kings, authority, patriarchy, and hierarchy remain fundamentally legitimate. Rumpelstiltskin becomes a scapegoat, carrying anxieties the culture no longer wanted, directed toward existing systems of power. And that makes the ending deeply modern. Because modern societies constantly personalize systemic problems into symbolic villains. One monster, one outsider, one deviant figure blamed for tensions actually created by much larger structures. The Grimm ending also reflects a growing obsession with purification through destruction. This period of European history increasingly framed morality in absolute terms: good people versus evil people, civilized versus uncivilized, pure versus corrupt. Ambiguity became threatening. And older folklore was full of ambiguity. That's what made it powerful. Earlier versions of Rumpelstiltskin understood something psychologically realistic. Dangerous systems often survive. Power structures continue. The world remains morally messy. But the Grimms reshape the story into a fantasy of total moral cleansing. The evil thing destroys itself once exposed. Problem solved. Except the real world doesn't work that way, and the fairy tale quietly knows it. Because even after Rumpelstiltskin dies, the original conditions that created him still exist. The king remains greedy. The hierarchy remains intact. Women still function inside transactional systems. Power still demands impossible production. The monster disappears, but the machine survives. That tension is part of why the story endured into the modern era. Because audiences instinctively understand something unresolved still lingers underneath the ending. The threat was never just the creature itself. The threat was the entire system that made the bargain possible. And in the 20th century, psychologists would finally begin interpreting the story in exactly those terms. Not as a tale about an external demon, but as a map of the human mind itself. The psychological shadow. The monster inside the human mind. By the 20th century, the modern world no longer believed in goblins hiding beneath bridges or demons lurking inside spinning wheels. At least officially. Science had replaced superstition. Industry replaced folklore. Psychology replaced religion as the dominant language for explaining invisible human suffering. But something strange happened. The fairy tales refused to die. Because even after modernity stripped away belief in literal magic, people still recognized themselves inside these stories. Especially Rumpelstiltskin. And that's where psychology enters the tale. Not to destroy its meaning, but to uncover the final layer hidden underneath every version that came before. In the early 20th century, Swiss psychologist became fascinated by myths and fairy tales because he believed they preserved recurring patterns buried deep inside the human mind. He called these patterns archetypes. Universal symbolic structures appearing across cultures regardless of geography or religion. And when Jungian thinkers examined Rumpelstiltskin, they recognized something immediately. The creature behaves exactly like what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil in the comic book sense. It's the hidden part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. The ugly emotions, the forbidden impulses, the humiliating desires, the rage, the greed, the jealousy, the hunger for control. Everything we push into darkness because society tells us it is unacceptable. But repression creates a problem. What remains unnamed gains power. And suddenly Rumpelstiltskin transforms yet again. No longer blacksmith, no longer demon, no longer medieval predator. Now he becomes psychological reality itself. The thing hiding in the locked room of the mind. And notice how perfectly the story fits this interpretation. The king represents impossible external pressure, the crushing demands society places upon the individual. Produce more, achieve more, become more valuable, generate success no matter the emotional cost. The miller represents social ambition and ego-driven desperation. The part of ourselves willing to exaggerate, perform, or sacrifice authenticity in pursuit of status. The daughter becomes the conscious self trapped between impossible expectation and hidden emotional forces she does not fully understand. And Rumpelstiltskin? He emerges from darkness precisely when desperation reaches its peak. That's how the shadow works psychologically. It appears strongest when people feel powerless. And the bargains it offers are always seductive. I can solve your problem. I can save you. I can help you survive. But the price escalates gradually. First something small. Then something personal. Then eventually the future itself. That structure mirrors addiction almost perfectly. Substance abuse, workaholism, toxic relationships, compulsive behavior. The shadow always begins by appearing useful, helpful even, until eventually it starts demanding pieces of your identity in exchange for continued survival. And modern trauma psychology discovered something even more fascinating. Unacknowledged trauma behaves exactly like Rumpelstiltskin. The thing nobody names gains immense psychological authority. Families organize themselves around silence. Entire generations avoid speaking openly about abuse, addiction, violence, neglect, grief, shame. And what remains hidden begins controlling behavior from underneath conscious awareness. The unspoken becomes tyrannical. Modern therapists encounter this constantly. A family destroyed by alcoholism nobody discusses openly. A childhood trauma treated like it never happened. A cycle of violence passed between generations without language capable of confronting it directly. These become psychological Rumpelstiltskins, invisible forces demanding payment while operating in darkness. And here's the terrifying part. The story already understood the solution thousands of years before modern psychology developed clinical terminology for it. Name the thing. That's it. That's the entire climax. Not kill it, not suppress it, not pretend it doesn't exist. Name it. Because psychologically, naming creates boundaries around fear. Trauma researchers now understand that language itself helps regulate overwhelming emotional experience. Once pain becomes speakable, definable, communicable, it stops operating as infinite terror inside the nervous system. The unknown becomes known. The shadow becomes visible. The monster shrinks. And this explains why Rumpelstiltskin still resonates so strongly in modern culture, even when audiences no longer believe in literal supernatural beings. Because the emotional structure remains painfully true. Every society creates shadows. Every family creates shadows. Every individual creates shadows. The story survives because human beings still recognize the experience of feeling trapped by forces they cannot fully articulate. Impossible expectations, economic anxiety, shame, abuse, depression, addiction, identity itself. All of them function like hidden names waiting to be spoken aloud. And notice something extraordinary about the Queen's victory. She does not destroy Rumpelstiltskin through violence. She doesn't overpower him physically. She doesn't wait for a prince to save her. She survives through recognition, through understanding, through language. That's an astonishingly sophisticated psychological idea for a story whose roots stretch back 4,000 years. The tale repeatedly insists that awareness itself is transformative. Once the hidden thing is identified clearly, it loses the ability to dominate reality completely. And suddenly, every earlier version of the story clicks together at once. The Bronze Age feared dangerous technological knowledge. The ancient world feared supernatural contracts. The medieval world feared exploitation and coercion. The industrial world feared mechanized labor systems. The modern world fears invisible psychological damage. Different centuries. Same structure. Something hidden exerts power over human life until somebody learns how to identify it precisely. That's why Rumpelstiltskin never disappeared. Because every generation eventually encounters its own locked room, its own impossible demand, its own shadow waiting in darkness offering survival at a terrible price. And every generation must eventually face the same terrifying question. What is the true name of the thing controlling us? The real message of Rumpelstiltskin. Name the thing that controls you. After 4,000 years, Rumpelstiltskin leaves us with one unavoidable realization. Every civilization that touched this story recognized the same pattern. Something powerful appears offering transformation. It promises survival, wealth, security, status, escape. But hidden inside the bargain is exploitation. And the longer the thing remains unnamed, the stronger it becomes. That is the secret buried underneath every version of the tale. And it's why Rumpelstiltskin never truly became obsolete. Because the story keeps adapting itself to whatever force society fears most. The Bronze Age feared secret technological power. The ancient world feared demons and sacred contracts. The medieval world feared forced marriage and feudal authority. The Industrial Revolution feared machinery and capitalist exploitation. Modern psychology fears invisible trauma and emotional repression. But all these layers coexist simultaneously. That's what makes the story extraordinary. When you hear Rumpelstiltskin today, your mind is unconsciously processing thousands of years of accumulated human anxiety stacked on top of itself like archaeological sediment. And every layer still functions. That's why the story feels strangely heavier than other fairy tales. Because underneath the fantasy, humanity kept using it as a warning system. A coded survival manual updated by every generation. And the central warning never changes. Be careful of systems demanding impossible production in exchange for survival. Look closely at the structure one final time. A vulnerable person is trapped inside conditions they did not create. Authority figures demand impossible results. A mysterious force appears promising miraculous transformation. The price escalates gradually. And eventually the future itself becomes collateral. That structure exists everywhere in human history. Feudal labor, industrial factories, debt systems, exploitative relationships, authoritarian governments, psychological abuse, even modern digital culture, especially modern digital culture. Because now entire economies run on impossible productivity expectations, endless content creation, constant performance, infinite availability. People turning themselves into products while algorithms consume their identities piece by piece. The spinning room never disappeared. It just got Wi-Fi. And that's why the story still lands emotionally. Because people instinctively recognize the feeling of being trapped inside systems demanding more than human beings can sustainably give. More labor, more beauty, more success, more emotional performance, more productivity, more sacrifice. Always more. The king still exists. The bargain still exists. Rumpelstiltskin still exists. Only the costumes changed. And yet the story does not end in hopelessness. That's the remarkable part. Because despite all its darkness, Rumpelstiltskin ultimately argues something deeply optimistic about human beings. The queen survives. Not because she becomes physically stronger than the system. Not because somebody rescues her. Not because the world suddenly becomes fair. She survives because she learns how to identify the thing manipulating her. Knowledge becomes liberation. And that lesson survived every era because it keeps proving true. Psychologically, politically, socially. Unnamed fear expands infinitely. Unnamed abuse continues indefinitely. Unnamed systems hide comfortably behind confusion and complexity. But once people clearly articulate the mechanism controlling them, the spell weakens. History is full of examples. Workers naming exploitation, women naming abuse, trauma survivors naming violence, citizens naming corruption, communities naming propaganda, patients naming illness. Every major liberation movement in human history begins with language. First somebody says, "This thing exists." Then somebody says, "This thing has a name." And eventually enough people say, "We are no longer pretending this is normal." That's the moment power starts panicking. That's the moment Rumpelstiltskin begins tearing himself apart. Because systems built on hidden exploitation rely heavily on confusion, silence, shame, and inevitability. The creature only appears invincible while operating in darkness. Once illuminated clearly, its authority fractures. And suddenly the final image of the story changes meaning completely. For centuries, audiences focused on the dramatic moment where Rumpelstiltskin destroys himself in rage. But the truly important detail is simpler than that. The Queen speaks. That's the climax. A woman who began the story isolated, powerless, traded between authority figures like property, ends it by publicly naming the force that controlled her. Language becomes resistance. And that may be the deepest reason this tale endured for 4 millennia. Because human beings keep rediscovering the same terrifying truth. Power survives longest when people cannot describe it clearly. The moment exploitation becomes visible, the moment hidden systems become speakable, the moment fear becomes language, the machinery starts breaking down. That's the real secret hidden inside Rumpelstiltskin. Not gold. Not magic. Recognition. 4,000 years of human beings leaving each other the same message over and over again across history, like a warning carved into stone. Learn the true name of what controls you. Speak it aloud. And watch the spell collapse. Rumpelstiltskin was never just a fairy tale. Not really. Fairy tales survive because they attach themselves to fears human beings never fully escape. And for 4,000 years, this story kept evolving because every civilization that inherited it recognized the same pattern repeating in different forms. A force appears promising transformation. It offers survival, wealth, security, power. But hidden inside the bargain is exploitation. The Bronze Age saw that force in the forge. Ancient civilizations saw it in demons and sacred names. Medieval Europe saw it in marriage, kings, and inherited hierarchy. Industrial society saw it in factories and machines. Modern psychology sees it in trauma, repression, and the hidden machinery of the human mind. Different eras, different costumes, same structure. And maybe that's why the story still unsettles people even now. Because deep down, everyone recognizes the spinning room. That feeling of being trapped inside impossible expectations. Of being valued only for productivity. Of bargaining pieces of yourself away just to survive another day. That part never became outdated. The room just got modernized. Now it glows blue from phone screens instead of candlelight. Now the machines live inside algorithms instead of textile mills. Now people spin identity into content instead of straw into gold. But the emotional architecture remains exactly the same. And through all these centuries, the story preserved one final piece of survival knowledge humanity refused to let die. Unnamed power grows unchecked. Named power begins to weaken. That's the secret hidden underneath the entire tale. Not magic. Recognition. The Queen saves herself the moment she understands exactly what she's dealing with. Not before. Because once something can be spoken clearly, it can finally be confronted. That applies to tyrants, to systems, to addictions, to abuse, to fear itself. The story survives because human beings keep needing that reminder. And maybe that's why Rumpelstiltskin never disappeared. Because every generation eventually encounters its own version of the creature lurking in the dark room, offering impossible solutions at impossible prices. And every generation has to learn the same lesson all over again. Learn its name. Speak it aloud. And watch the illusion begin to tear itself apart. If you enjoyed this deep dive into folklore, history, psychology, and humanity's 4,000-year tradition of turning collective trauma into bedtime stories, welcome to the Pizzaverse. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, grab an espresso, and prepare yourself because this rabbit hole only gets darker from here. More hidden history, more ancient symbolism, more documentaries uncovering the terrifying things humanity buried inside stories we pretend are for children. Only on Pizzaverse Studios, where we don't rewrite history. We excavate it. To everybody watching, thank you for supporting independent storytelling, independent research, and independent creators willing to stare directly into humanity's weird little psychological abyss and say, hey, maybe these fairy tales were trying to warn us about something. Seriously. The support means everything. Every comment, every share, every late-night viewer spiraling into existential dread at 2 a.m. because a tiny medieval goblin suddenly started making too much sense. That's family now. From all of us at Pizzaverse Studios, thank you for being part of the social club. And remember, if a strange little man shows up in the middle of the night offering unlimited wealth in exchange for vague future consequences, maybe read the contract twice.
Rumpelstiltskin's Gold Spinning Starter Kit. Turning worthless garbage into wealth since the Bronze Age. Are you trapped in a collapsing medieval economy? Did some psychotic king lock you in a tower and demand impossible productivity quotas by sunrise? Do you suffer from feudal anxiety? Generational trauma? Economic exploitation? Or a complete inability to meet unrealistic workplace expectations? Well, good news, sweetheart. Introducing the all-new Rumpelstiltskin's Gold Spinning Starter Kit, the only supernatural economic survival package trusted by deranged monarchs, desperate peasants, and emotionally unstable fairy tale characters for over 4,000 years. For just 3 easy payments and 1 morally questionable future consequence, you can experience the miracle of impossible production. Inside every starter kit you'll receive 1 cursed spinning wheel forged in the psychological furnace of collective human suffering, unlimited straw, 1 suspicious little night goblin with deeply concerning energy, ancient forbidden metallurgy secrets, a legally binding supernatural contract, and a free sample vial of medieval sleep deprivation. But wait, there's more. Order now and we'll throw in our exclusive true name identification system. That's right. Simply uncover the hidden psychological structure controlling your life and watch the supernatural entity collapse into existential rage before your very eyes. Amazing. Users report naming: capitalism, trauma, narcissistic ex-boyfriends, exploitative labor systems, toxic live stream communities, and unresolved family damage. With incredible results, side effects may include enlightenment, industrial era despair, severe class consciousness, psychological breakthroughs, and tiny screaming men tearing themselves apart in your living room. And folks, let me tell you something. Other products promise transformation. But only Rumpelstiltskin's gold spinning starter kit combines Bronze Age metallurgy, Egyptian name magic, medieval economic horror, and modern trauma psychology, all in one convenient cursed package. Still not convinced? Listen to these real customer testimonials. I traded away my firstborn and honestly, my Etsy store took off. Gertrude, Bavaria. I named the thing controlling me and suddenly my entire bloodline started going to therapy. Klaus, Frankfurt. 5 stars, terrifying experience. Anonymous medieval queen. So, don't wait. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that humanity absolutely refuses to stop making catastrophic bargains with mysterious little creeps offering financial opportunities. Rumpelstiltskin's gold spinning starter kit. Because processing your trauma normally is for cowards. Straw not included. Firstborn child may be subject to collection. Offer void where exorcisms are prohibited. Pizzaverse Studios not responsible for demonic contracts, class uprisings, or supernatural workplace violations.
Give me groceries and booze. Give me FaceTime with my friends. Give me intravenous news. Little drips of CNN. Give me meditation apps. Text me pictures of your dog. Just give me life. Give me peace. Give me noise. Someone give me fucking zen. Someone give me fucking zen.
At least 6 feet. Dig my grave just as deep. I got sex on my mind all the time. Fuck, scrolling through the internet, time suck. I've been feeling flat like a pancake. I could use a hug or a handshake. I could use some drugs or a band-aid. Cooped up in a hole, I wanna lose all my control. I wanna just go on a rampage. Give me wisdom, give me teeth. Give me vision, let me see. Give me courage to confess. Every night I text my ex. Give me girls. Give me boys, give me life, give me peace, give me noise. Someone
give me fucking zen. Someone give me fucking zen. Give me fucking zen. I need something to avoid all of my fears and paranoia. Give me, someone give me fucking zen. Yeah. Give me an appetite, give me hope for the afterlife, or a reason to look past tonight. Give me happiness when I found the fame. Give me music that doesn't all sound the same. Give me something that I could look forward to. Give me humans that I could get closer to. You look down at me, but the next thing you know, it's you with the rent overdue. Give me a little bit of piece of your peace of mind. Give me a piece of yours, you'll get the peace of mind. Give me something to do when there's nothing to do, but when I get it, shit, I'll probably just fuck it up too. Give me 2 steps to the left. Give me 1 step to the right. Give me 1 dance with the volume at 10. And someone, anyone, give me fucking zen. Someone give me fucking zen. Give me fucking zen. I need something to avoid all of my fears and paranoia. Give me, someone give me hope for something better. Give me justice for my cries. Tell me we're all in this together, and if we're not, then tell me lies. Give me love, give me Wi-Fi, give me drugs, give me sky high, give me headspace, set my head straight, cut the dead